Okay, I will get started because this is sort of a little bit of a more long-winded introduction this week, and I want to leave enough time for Michael because what he'll say is much more important, what I'm going to share. So welcome, everybody. Thank you, especially for those of you who showed up right at 12:30. I want to just tell you a heads up personally. I am teaching a class right before this, so if ever it's like 12:29 and where's Derek, I haven't forgotten. I'm probably being held back by a student, but I will try to get here at 12:30 sharp each Wednesday. This is a pleasure for me to organize our second annual, I guess, for winter quarter seminar series on wildfire policy and research. It's going to be over Zoom, as you see, probably already in the participant list. We have some guests that are joining us. We'll have some speakers that are joining us from different parts of the world as well, typically in the Western Hemisphere, so we'll have to navigate time zone constraints. But this is going to be a purely virtual series. We will be recording it with the exception of maybe one or two, because a couple of people are struggling with clearance from their employer, and I want to respect that. So we're going to try to record these and make them available if you missed them, but I can't promise all the sessions will be recorded and distributed. That being said, welcome. This is an exciting series for me to facilitate. We're in a strange time where people may have already forgotten about wildfires given floods. I would actually disagree with the assessment that we're out of a drought. We have to worry about wildfires. I wear another hat. Perhaps I've given too big of an advertisement on the top of this slide. I direct the Big Earth Hackathon series, Wildland Fire Challenge, which will happen this spring. I'm hoping to inspire both faculty and students this quarter of some of the relevant problems related to wildfires. And one of them, which is really relevant, is the connection between flooding and wildfires and risk that might be due to even enhanced precipitation. We're going to explore a lot of different things this quarter. I think we have got a great set of speakers lined up to talk about a bunch of diverse topics related to policy, as well as research being done to address some of the many problems related to wildfires. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Michael Wara, who has taken the time to join us today. He's one of the busiest men on campus, but he always is willing to share his time with me and many people. He is a lawyer and scholar who generally focuses on climate and energy policy. He is a senior research scholar at the Woods Institute for the Environment and director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program. If you didn't know this already, he is currently the interim policy director for the Sustainability Accelerator in our new Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Michael's legal and policy scholarship focuses on carbon pricing, energy innovation, and regulated industries. He collaborates with economists, engineers, and science in research on the design and evaluation of technical and regulatory solutions to climate, energy, and of course, wildfire challenges. This sort of collaboration is quite evident in his expertise in the wildfire arena. He's also been an associate professor at the law school, an associate at Hall & Knight's government practice. He holds a JD from Stanford Law School, as well as a PhD in ocean sciences from UC Santa Cruz, making him a kindred spirit to this oceanographer in training as well. I really say this in all truth. I don't know of anyone at Stanford, anyone else I've met who has a more comprehensive and wide-reaching understanding of both wildfire science and policy. I've learned a lot from Michael over, say, the last 5-6 years, and I'm sure you have a lot to learn. You have a lot to share with us today, and if you have a chance to meet with him in person, he will educate you so much about wildfires in a very easy to understand set of language, and makes a compelling vision of what we need to be looking at and what we need to be focusing on. He's going to talk today about the Clean Air Act. I think his abstract, if you read it, is very compelling, but I want to let him share his insights and questions and maybe suggestions of where we might go to unravel this very complicated small piece of the wildfire space, namely, how do wildfires and prescribed burns relate to the quality of the air we breathe? So with that being said, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to Michael. Thank you for being with us, Michael.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for the kind introduction. Let me just pull up my presentation and we'll get started. So as Derek said, I'm going to talk today about, well, thanks for coming. It's really great to see so many of my colleagues on the little screens on the right. I'm excited to talk today about an issue that we're going to be working on intensively this year in our smoke policy practicum, which is a course I've been running with Debbie Civis and a number of the folks who are on this Zoom today. Cassie Gerenci and Eric McComber in particular are two of our legal fellows, but a course focused on wildfire policy generally, and in particular on facilitating policy measures that allow for the greater use of what I will call beneficial fire, prescribed fire, cultural burning, and managed wildfire to improve ecosystem resilience, and hopefully improve air outcomes, as we'll talk a little bit about, and increase the safety of communities in the West. I'll tell you that the issue I'm going to talk about today, which we'll talk more about, but regulation of fine particulate matter, has really become, I think, the most pressing issue in wildfire policy happening right now. And it really is kind of hot off the presses. On last fall, the rule that I'll talk about was transmitted to the Office of Management and Budget, and it was released on January 6th by EPA for notice and comment purposes. And I think it has the potential to profoundly shape what happens in the Western United States over the next 10 years. So I'm going to share a little bit about that perspective and kind of, I think this is conceptually a really interesting problem, because the Clean Air Act was really written and enacted at a time where, kind of the apogee of the old way of managing forests and fire in the United States, right? Not one spark, Smokey the Bear will protect you. And if he doesn't, the smoke jumpers will show up in their airplanes and put out the fires before 10 a.m. And that's smaller than 10 acres. And the fire suppression paradigm that we had has fundamentally broken down in the Western US, partly due to our management of forests, right? The fire suppression over really in California since the 1870s, but also due to the growing impacts of climate change, the changes in seasonal vapor pressure deficit that appear to be driving the enhanced and much more significant fire behavior. And I would definitely second what Derek said. Last year we got lucky. I'll take luck. But the mosquito fire that was really put out by the September rain that we got was on track to be one of the most destructive and costly wildfires in California history, when we had a typhoon in the Gulf of Alaska and it rained like crazy in mid-September. So, thank goodness, but we should not rest on our laurels. So I'm going to talk about the Clean Air Act today. I'll just skip forward here. Talk about the Clean Air Act today. But before I do that, I want to talk about PM 2.5 as an air pollutant, and how PM 2.5 is managed under the Clean Air Act, the legal regime that governs this particularly deadly air pollutant. And then I'll talk a little bit about the current PM 2.5 rulemaking that's underway, a national ambient air quality standard rulemaking. I'll talk about how that conflicts with our goals for wildfire and prescribed fire in the Western United States and in California in particular, and mention some options for solving for both lower fossil particulate matter, which we definitely want. A lot of particulates come from diesel soot and from coal-fired combustion, and we want fewer of those in children's lungs in particular, but how we can solve for that goal, and also better wildfire management. And I think we need to really be thinking about how to have our cake and eat it too in this context. And I would argue that the agency right now is not doing that, which is extremely unfortunate, especially for the West, especially for California, as I'll show you. So why is PM 2.5 such a big deal? PM 2.5 is basically just anything that's smaller than 2.5 microns. It's sort of an odd air pollutant in the sense that most air pollutants we define by their chemistry, right? Like nitrogen oxides, for example, or sulfur dioxide, or lead. But This size class, these very small particles are particularly dangerous because they are small enough to cross the barrier through your lungs and get into your bloodstream. They travel through your blood and they cause all kinds of, and they actually do very bad things to your lungs as well. Before they do that, they get into the smallest of the air spaces in your lungs, and then cross into your blood and can cause significant cardiovascular health impacts. One of the big impacts of elevated PM 2.5 exposure is cardiac arrest, in particular out of hospital cardiac arrest, which is particularly deadly. It's not like on TV where they just always have the defibrillators handy and they just zap you and you wake up and you're fine. There's also really a growing body of evidence across a variety of other morbidity and mortality impacts that PM 2.5 is just a really bad air pollutant. And it's bad for you down to essentially zero concentration. In fact, there's some evidence that the biggest effects are seen from going from zero to relatively modest concentrations, and then there may be some saturation level. And the key at-risk groups are kids with growing lungs, the elderly, which could be particularly prone to that cardiac arrest risk, and also pregnant women and who are breathing for 2 often, or sometimes 3, and folks who have comorbidities. So it's pretty much the deadliest air pollutant or one of the deadliest air pollutants, and of course in developing countries, this is a huge issue and a major cause of premature death. India has particularly poor air quality related to PM 2.5. China has gotten better, but is still pretty bad. And hundreds of thousands of people die every year because of elevated air pollution associated with the combustion of fossil fuels and the particulates that result from incomplete combustion. The story around PM 2.5 in the United States from 2000 to 2019 is told by EPA is a very, very positive one. It's sort of the second great success in EPA's air regulatory history. The first was getting lead out of gasoline, but we've really cut PM 2.5 emissions in the United States quite significantly, using kind of throwing everything at the wall that we could and seeing what stuck. We got a lot of PM out of the air by lowering the air standard that I'm going to talk about today, the primary national ambient air quality standard. But we've also done other things like force coal plants to install much better pollution controls, eliminate exemptions. We cleaned up diesel fuel so that we could put scrubbers on diesel engines, and that's really started to improve air quality from on-road diesel combustion. So a variety of things, a variety of activities have really driven down average, seasonally weighted annual average PM 2.5 on a nationwide basis. At the same time, this is work from Marshall's group that just shows that shows that trend, right? In the upper figure, you see PM 2.5 declining. This is by region in the United States, but you see it declining. And then in about 2015, the West and the Northwest sort of head in a different direction, right? And the trends are really reversed. And you could say that, in the West, we're sort of back where we were circa 2005 in terms of PM 2.5 exposures. And Marshall's team also, were able to separate the PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke from other sources of PM 2.5, all those diesel trucks running out to the Amazon logistics centers, and show that the increase is really being driven in these Western regions by wildfire smoke. So we're seeing a reversal of air pollution improvement trends that favor public health in the West. And I'll just note on these scales, the national annual average is currently at 12 on that figure G, and the discussion is whether to lower it to 10. So we're right in that, and there are folks who believe that it should be lowered to 8. So that's kind of the framework that we're going to be operating in for this talk. It's important to note that when EPA thinks about PM 2.5, they exclude wildfire emissions from the analysis. That's because wildfires are treated as kind of a natural, uncontrollable event, rather than something that is a source, an intentional human emission source subject to regulation. So you see that in this figure. This is a nice figure from a number of EPA scientists that just sums up kind of where the PM 2.5 is coming from. And just notice how biogenic wildfire is that column above that's just not connected to anything. This is sort of how the PM 2.5 is being generated, and then what it's used for, what kinds of products it makes, and where the impacts are felt of those products. Currently, EPA estimates that about 30% of the PM 2.5 in the United States is generated by wildfire smoke on a national basis on an annual average. Of course, people don't live in a national annual average. They live in a place and time, and they experience particular moments in time where air pollution can be better or worse. This is a figure that was put together by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District just to show the impact of wildfire on local air quality. And this notably doesn't include 2019 and 2020. Y'all may remember 2020 as the year when the sky turned orange and the kind of sun never rose in September. So if this were updated, it would show those effects and show that while residential wood smoke has been and continues to be a significant air quality concern, at this point, the most acute exposures to particulate matter in the Bay Area, at any rate, are due to wildfire. And that's a trend we're likely to see continue because of the fact that most climate models suggest that we're going to see an extension and a kind of enhancement of the conditions that lead to large and high intensity wildfires as the climate warms. Okay, PM 2.5 is a problem. It's a problem that's getting worse. It's a problem that's getting worse in particular places, notably the West and Northwest regionally, and in specific parts of those places. What is the regulatory and legal regime that governs this pollutant in the United States? In the US, PM 2.5 is regulated as a criteria air pollutant. And what that means is it's a set of there's a small class of pollutants, about half a dozen, that are regulated in a specific way under the Clean Air Act. The way that they're regulated is that the US EPA, after receiving advice from a committee of public health scientists, sets national ambient air quality standards for each of these pollutants. The other pollutants include sulfur dioxide, ozone, nitrogen oxides, pretty familiar pollutants that are mainly caused by combustion of fossil fuels. PM 2.5 has an annual standard and a 24-hour standard. That means there's one sort of level that's allowed. It has to be met on an average basis for a local, for a state and for air quality management districts within the state. And there's another standard that can't be exceeded on a 24-hour basis. It's more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into the nuance. You can sort of get the idea. There's sort of a chronic exposure level and then an acute exposure level. And the chronic exposure level is currently set at 12 micrograms per meters cubed, and the acute exposure level is at 35 micrograms per meters cubed. Once EPA sets the standard, the health standard, and they're supposed to set it to protect the public health with an extra margin of safety, the states then are charged with developing what are called state implementation plans. I may slip into EPA acronym speak. I apologize if I do, but they're also called SIPs, right? State Implementation Plan. And the goal of a SIP is, see, I did it, of an implementation plan is to achieve the national ambient air quality standard that's been set by EPA. So EPA sets the goal, the states figure out how to achieve the goal. This is an incredibly complex process for something like PM 2.5 that's emitted by so many different sources. But we've been doing it for the better part of 50 years. And there's sort of an accepted approach to doing it. And part of that approach is, well, actually, I'll leave it at that. Now, PM 2.5 is also emitted, particulates are emitted by sources that are uncontrollable, are truly not manageable sources. And given that EPA is the states are charged with achieving these goals that EPA sets, and there are real consequences if they fail to achieve the goals. There's also a policy under the Clean Air Act for how to manage these uncontrollable sources. Now, I think Mount St. Helens is a great example of this. Like, no one can control whether a volcano erupts. We have no means of controlling the ash fallout from a volcano. If Mount St. Helens were to erupt, there would be significant exceedances of PM 2.5. It wouldn't be safe to go outside and breathe the air for a long time, no doubt, until the ash got rained out or settled out. And you couldn't really blame Oregon or Washington for the air quality in their states if a Cascade volcano erupted. That would seem odd, right? And it would seem odd to then say, as a consequence of this eruption, no more new stationary sources, which is one, or no, the policies around siting new power plants or rules around diesel combustion and other kinds of things have to change in Oregon and Washington because a volcano erupted. But that's what might occur, except for something called the exceptional events policy under the Clean Air Act, which says that defines an exceptional event as something that's uncontrollable, unpreventable, unlikely to recur, and a natural event. And for events that EPA determines are exceptional, allows for the exclusion of data, of air quality data that's altered by those events from assessment of whether a state has or has not achieved the ambient air quality standards. So one thing to note about this is, this is possible. It's infrequently used, and the exceptional events determination gets made by EPA after the fact when the state submits its data for compliance to EPA. Wildfires have generally counted as exceptional events. There was a recent update to the rule, recent 2016, that sort of clarified and modified the policies around wildfire. EPA has suggested that prescribed fire might also count as an exceptional event. Normally, prescribed fire is a permitted source of air emission, so it counts just like a smokestack, because prescribed fire is intentionally set, and therefore it is controllable, or it should be, and it is not. It's definitely man-made, and it has lots of characteristics that make it look like, in particular, agricultural burning, which is definitely a major source of air emissions, as we'll see when we look at some San Joaquin data. Although EPA issued guidance as to how prescribed fire might count as an exceptional event, no state has ever asked for an exceptional events determination for prescribed fire. So there's sort of untested ideas around how this might work. And I'll tell you that talking to state regulators, they are reluctant to ever have to use exceptional events determinations because they are perceived as burdensome and risky, right? If you have to ask for an exceptional events determination, you're taking the chance that you might not get it. There are significant evidentiary burdens that are placed on the air agencies in order to get an EED from the US EPA. And if you don't get it, you might be in non-attainment, which would mean that a whole set of legal mechanisms come into play that's going to affect everything you do as an air regulator. So there's significant risk here. And that risk also is part of the reason that no one has ever tried to use this for prescribed fire, because if they didn't get an exceptional events determination, it's too late. They are in non-attainment with the act, and they would have to take remedial action, probably involving both their prescribed fire, but also perhaps other regulated sources in order to come back into attainment. So there's real risk here, and we just don't know kind of how this policy will work if it is ever used.
Derek, can we ask questions? Or do you want us to wait till
Oh yeah, please go by me on me. I didn't clear it with Michael, but I assume he'd be happy to take your question.
Totally fine.
Hey, Michael, thanks. This is awesome. Could you clarify that? So why would applying for it make it more likely, increase the risk of non-attainment? Wouldn't you be in non-attainment anyway, because that's just read off the monitor?
Well, so if the choice is so in order to be in non-attainment due to prescribed fire, you would have had to use prescribed fire such that you exceeded the PM 2.5 ambient air quality standards. And then later, when you submit for your attainment status for a determination of whether you're in attainment or not to EPA, then and only then is it appropriate to ask for an exceptional events determination. So there's a timing issue here where you have to allow the prescribed fire before you know whether you've gotten an exceptional events determination. And the separation in time is pretty significant.
I see. So the risk is as much in using the fire as in getting
yeah, well, if you use the fire, yeah, I mean, you'll be safer, maybe.
Right.
But
from a regulatory perspective.
But from a regulatory risk
risk
perspective, you just don't know that you're going to get this. When a wildfire happens, you kind of have no choice, right? Or if it's the same as if a volcano erupts, or it's not quite the same, but an agency finds itself in a situation, they go to EPA and say, hey, we did everything we could. If the volcano hadn't erupted, we would have been in attainment, but it did, and so we aren't. That's a different, there are different incentives there than where the agency has to issue permits for years and then maybe or maybe not gets this determination.
Okay, cool, thanks.
No problem. So every 5 years or so, EPA reevaluates the ambient air quality standards it has based on the best available science, right? The idea is to keep them current with what's the learnings in the public health community, and to make sure that if things need to be more or made more stringent or perhaps less stringent, that's never happened, but I guess it could, that the rules are updated. And for a variety of reasons, EPA has not lowered the PM 2.5 ambient air quality standard since 2012, even as science has accumulated like mountains of science that it probably should be lowered. EPA just proposed, as I mentioned, on January 6th, lowering the standard. The standard, the proposal that was issued proposes lowering the annual PM 2.5 limit from 12 to 10 and leaves unchanged, but asks for comment on lowering the 24-hour limit below 35. The response from the public health and EJ community was rapid and very disappointed. I think it's fair to say. And I think everyone in the EJ community that's very focused on protecting public health, particularly in communities that are adjacent to heavy industry, really wanted to see the 24-hour standard lowered, and it wasn't. The response from the wildfire, and especially the prescribed fire community, in contrast, has been near, I think maybe panic is too strong a word. I probably shouldn't have said that in a slide, but hopefully this is like a home crowd. But people are very concerned, and they're concerned not only about what the new standards might mean for current practices, but more than that, as I'll talk about, what the new standards might mean for the proposals that have been in development and whose implementation is really just beginning to change our relationship with fire and improve wildfire outcomes in the Western United States. Remember, a key distinction that I made is that prescribed fire requires a permit under the Act. It is treated like a smokestack. Wildfire is always treated as an uncontrolled kind of event that the air agency is not responsible for. So there's an asymmetry there that's very important. The rule notes, and this is sort of interesting language, that's why I quoted it, that EPA acknowledges that other agencies, governments, and tribes believe that prescribed fire is an important tool for reducing wildfire risk and PM 2.5 emissions. So EPA acknowledges that others believe. It does not accept the truth of that proposition, but it does acknowledge that others believe. The rule also notes that 30% of US PM 2.5 emissions are from wildfire. And the rule's regulatory impact assessment, which is kind of a key document that's used to understand the potential impacts of the rule, its costs and benefits. It's what the President's Office of Management and Budget really focuses on when they look at a rule. Is the rule assumes that 2016 PM 2.5 emissions are representative of emissions today and for purposes of planning for 2032. It assumes wildfire levels as in 2016 and prescribed fire levels as in 2016. And just recall back to those figures from Marshall Burke's earlier paper that the kink in wildfire happens right around 2015 or 2016. So that's kind of the minimum in PM 2.5 emissions in the United States. And it's the point where wildfire begins to reassert itself as a really important contributor to air pollution in the West and Northwest. So I pulled this figure from the regulatory impact assessment because I think it's really important to understand that this rule is really about the West with a few very limited exceptions. That's because if you lower the annual standard, there's only a few places in the country that actually have emissions that will be higher than that standard, that will face challenges with ambient air quality standard attainment. And they tend to be in California and in Idaho. The vast majority of people that will be affected by the rule in terms of having lower PM 2.5 perhaps than they otherwise would have are located in Southern California and the San Joaquin, in the South Coast Air Basin and the San Joaquin Valley. This is the southern part of the Central Valley of California. So this means that we really need to be thinking about this rule from the perspective of the actual air quality conditions that those places are experiencing today, right? The rule doesn't matter if you live in Colorado, because Colorado already has low enough particulate matter levels to achieve a 10 micrograms per meter squared annual average standard. The San Joaquin Valley does not, other parts of California do not, and a few counties in Idaho. So I just pulled this also from the regulatory impact assessment because I think it illustrates some of the challenges here. This is what's called a source inventory for particulate matter for the San Joaquin Valley counties for a 2032 modeling case. And something to note here, that this is modeling all sources, although prescribed fire is basically assumed at 2016 levels. You can see that it's sort of fourth from the left. And it doesn't include wildfire emissions because those are assumed not to count, even though, of course, they count if you're a kid taking the bus to school in Bakersfield. The text does acknowledge that the PM 2.5 emissions associated with wildfire in 2016 in the San Joaquin Valley counties was 22,000 tons. So that dwarfs any of these numbers. It's a factor of 10 higher than the higher values, or I guess it's a factor of 7 higher than the dust and ag produced particulate matter. So a couple things to note here. Prescribed fire is sort of a significant source, but not the highest source of anthropogenic emissions at 2016 levels, and wildfire is a dominant source. So under this framework, it is possible, I think, and I think the EPA believes, to identify anthropogenic sources, reduction of which would allow achievement of the annual average goal that it's proposed, right? You could get to 10, even in the San Joaquin Valley, perhaps, if you, for example, reduce agricultural burning significantly, right? You say a major source of particulate emissions in the valley is the burning of prunings from all of those orchards that you see when you drive down I-5. All those almond trees have to get pruned, and no one knows what to do with all of the wood that comes off of them. And the current answer is burn it in open burning. That causes enormous quantities, more than almost 3,000 tons per year of PM 2.5 that accumulates in the valley. So if you eliminate that, you can create a lot of room to achieve that 10 micrograms per meter squared standard. That's true as long as prescribed fire doesn't change very much. And that's the thing I want to talk about next. So the goals for wildland and prescribed fire, to understand the goals, you need to sort of have some sense of kind of where we are now. Our data, this is work that I think Jill may be on this call, Jill and Jeff Wen Jill Horing and Jeff Wen, I think they were earlier. They've looked at and others too at acreage and trends in acreage, and it's safe to say we burned less than this this year, but we're burning approximately 1 million acres a year in California. It depends on the window over which you average, because it appears that the wildfire problem is accelerating in California, so we're burning more and more. But call it 1 million acres a year. Our current prescribed fire acreage in California is a little bit above 100,000 acres. It might be as high as 130, 140,000 acres a year. This is a picture of the Creek Fire blow up. The day that the Creek Fire really exploded in intensity required, you may remember, evacuations from around Shaver Lake in Chinook helicopters that occurred, where everyone was trapped at this little resort community in the Southern Sierra and had to be flown out before the fire burned over the community. The Southern Sierra has been a place where fuel treatment needs are urgent. There's been significant tree die-offs there associated with the drought. There has also been really dramatic fire activity there, and pretty strong evidence that the use of thinning and prescribed fire, the combination especially, can create real safety benefits and even reduce fire intensity as well. Why is it not letting me? So state and federal strategies began really with a memorandum of understanding between CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service, where they said, in order to get out of the hole that we're in California, we need to treat 1 million acres a year, 500,000 acres of state responsibility and 500,000 acres of federal responsibility. And we want to primarily do that. We want to do that as much as possible with prescribed fire. The U.S. Forest Service last year rolled out a 10-year strategy for dealing with the wildfire crisis in the West that relies heavily on prescribed fire as the tool that will actually create safety and ecosystem resilience in and around communities on federal land. California last year released a beneficial fire strategy where they propose going from about 100,000 acres a year, where we are now, to 400,000 acres a year. And I should say the CAL FIRE U.S. Forest MOU aims, we're not going to get there, but the goal was to get there by 2025 to 1 million acres a year. So California's policy is to dramatically increase the level of prescribed fire. ARB and the air quality management districts in California have gone to extensive efforts to facilitate air permitting for prescribed fire. And they've really made tons of progress in terms of enhancing the ability of burners, when they have an approved burn plan from CAL FIRE and it's safe to go out and put fire on the ground, to get the permission they need from the air districts to do that. That's happened really since 2017, over the last 5 years or so. At the same time, we're throwing money at this problem. There's a ton of money in the Inflation Reduction Act for much greater levels of fuels treatment. There's also staffing to try to help make this a reality. It's not as much as people like me think there should be, but it's a significant down payment. The California budget over the last several years has grown the amount of money that's being given away in grants to do all kinds of fuels management, not just prescribed fire, but a lot of that money is going to prescribed fire. It's gone from a couple $100 million a year. Actually, it was less than before 2017, we were about $100 million a year. This year, we are at 1.2 billion. So factor of 10 increase. And then we're working in Smoke Lab with Senator Padilla's team to really shape the Farm Bill. The U.S. Forest Service is part of the USDA, right? It's trees are the U.S. Forest Service is a tree farmer essentially under U.S. law, and the Farm Bill is what authorizes subsidies and payments and all kinds of interactions between the federal government and private landowners that manage resources that the USDA is interested in, including trees. So the Farm Bill creates a really interesting opportunity to create programs within the U.S. Forest Service to facilitate the use of prescribed fire. None of this can really happen if prescribed fire violates the Clean Air Act. And that's the challenge we face right now, is how to facilitate not just the use, the relatively limited amount of prescribed fire that was occurring on lands late in the last decade, say 2016, 2017, and not the amount we have now, which is a significant increase, but still not enough. But we need to get to a much more significant level of returning fire to landscapes if we're going to actually achieve ecosystem resiliency in the face of climate change and create safety for communities. That's a picture I really like of the bootleg fire footprint. Bootleg fire was a big fire in Oregon in 2021. And this just shows 3 areas of the fire that were subject to different forest management strategies prior to the fire. On the left is an area where there was commercial thinning. In the middle of the image is an area where there was commercial thinning and prescribed fire, was utilized as a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and Native American tribes in the area. And on the right is an area that received no treatment. And you can see the really dramatic differences in fire behavior and the ability of the ecosystem to survive what was a very high intensity wildfire. We saw similar effects on the Caldor fire by Caples in the Caples Lake Ecosystem Restoration Project area. The Caldor fire was a fire that burned in 2022, the one that burned up and over Echo Summit and sort of hopped over South Lake Tahoe and into Nevada, where prescribed fire work that had been done by the Forest Service performed exceptionally well, slowed down the fire on its march toward Kirkwood, and also kept the forest intact, so that in the areas where there was prescribed fire prior to the Calder fire, we have intact ecosystems today instead of, dead toothpicks. Lowering, so that's what that picture is about. Lowering of the annual standard, I think most folks I've talked to believe will not likely limit current prescribed fire activity in California, but would prevent planned growth. So it sort of freezes the status quo. Lowering of the 24-hour standard, which remember, we want to do if we can protect, so that we can protect the health of people that live next to heavily polluting facilities. But if that standard is lowered, given the current regime, the current implementation regime, the belief is that it would substantially curtail the current level of prescribed fire in the Western United States, and definitely in California. The interesting dynamic here may be that EPA feels caught in a bind. They want to be protective of public health. Indeed, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee recommended going lower. This is the upper end of the range for 24 for the annual average, and they recommended lowering the 24-hour average. EPA took the upper end of the range for the annual and didn't lower the 24-hour. And it could well be that they didn't do that because of the feared effects on fire management and the conflict with the U.S. Forest Service that would result. They've released a number of documents in the release of the draft rule that suggest that they are concerned about that. The only FAQ that was released about the rule is specifically about wildfire. And so it does seem as if EPA is facing internal pushback on the rule from the Forest Service, the BLM, and perhaps FEMA, that's concerned about the rule's effect on disasters. As I said, use of I've been scouring the landscape, asking every air regulator I know if they know of any exceptional events determination for prescribed fire ever since the guidance was issued in 2017. The answer is no. There are not even any proposed, and there are places in the country where it would make a lot of sense to do it, particularly Georgia and northern Florida, where there's a very active and vibrant prescribed fire community. Everyone basically agrees that the EED use is unlikely because getting a determination is uncertain. We just don't know how the agency is going to respond and what data, what the level of risk is there. And because failure to obtain one entails very high costs, it fundamentally changes the air permitting regime for all of the stationary sources in an air district if the air district is in non-attainment. So what are the options? I think there are options, and I'm going to suggest a couple, moving from the easier to the harder and perhaps riskier. One option would be to change how exceptional events determinations are done for prescribed fire, and to move toward what lawyers would call a ministerial approach. That is that what ministerial means is that the agency doesn't have discretion whether or not to accept a filing. So a good example of this is if you want to build a house on a vacant lot that's zoned for residential construction, and you don't do anything that requires a variance, as long as you fill out your permit properly, the local planning agency kind of has to issue a permit. They don't really have a lot of discretion to say, oh, well, don't do this, or we don't like your facade, or what have you. This is possible. There are permitting regimes that EPA administers that are very much ministerial in nature, and EPA could specify that exceptional events determinations are going to be, moving forward, much more ministerial, lower risk for the districts. This would also potentially allow for more systematic planning of how prescribed fire is going to happen, rather than doing permit by permit and sort of seeing what happens at the end. The district could allocate a budget and very self-consciously say, this is how much prescribed fire we're going to allow. And it might result in exceedances on some days. And we're going to try to, and those exceedances could be coordinated with better planning to reduce exposure, even if not emissions. And I think one reality that wildfire is really challenging is the paradigm that is at the core of the Clean Air Act, that emissions can be controlled. Wildfire emissions are not being successfully controlled. They're growing. And some of the best hopes that we have for reducing public health impacts from wildfire, and just impacts from wildfire, have to do with substituting prescribed fire emission for high intensity wildfire emission. A more radical option would be to consider smoke as, or at least some degree of smoke, as part of sort of a baseline emissions level, and then allow choice of an air agency between whether that smoke occurs as wildfire or prescribed fire. This is moving toward a recognition of the natural role of fire in ecosystems. It's something the Clean Air Act is kind of blind to right now, and in fact is sort of anti-science on, if anything, right? And the reality, as many of you know, is that prior to conquest, California was very much a smoky place. We were burning something like 4 million acres a year. I want to say we, it's not we, the native peoples of California, Native Americans, were burning several million acres a year, at least, in low intensity fire. And that had dramatic impacts on the ecosystems. It dramatically reduced the frequency of high intensity fire because of fuel availability and also fragmentation of the fuels landscape, right? You don't have continuous fuels that can burn in one big push. And it would allow for ex ante as opposed to ex post planning about what some degree of smoke should look like. Now, how do we plan for that? It would also sort of call the question on whether wildfire is something that we can plan for over some reasonable time frame or not. And I think there are real questions there. I don't want to pretend that this is an easy idea. There are some models for this in the Clean Air Act. In particular, regional haze rules allow for some degree of haze that is associated with kind of baseline conditions, natural conditions. And so this would be recognizing that wildfire is a natural phenomenon in the West, as opposed to some unnatural thing that might happen every once in a while. It's just a picture of the Carr Fire, which to me is one of the scariest wildfires we've ever had in California. This was the one that generated a tornado that was about a half mile in diameter and sort of spun into downtown Redding, and then the weather changed and it just stopped, luckily, as it was entering a densely populated urban environment. A bunch of people still died, but it could have been a lot worse. And it's an illustration of kind of how catastrophic wildfire at intensities that we just do not recognize in the particularly over the time interval that much of the Clean Air Act, the statute, and also the regulatory interpretation, implementation of the statute has occurred, developed in a time when wildfire was different, when things like the Carr fire did not happen. And failure to recognize where we are now and where we are heading, I think, is really to the detriment of sound wildfire policy in the West. This year, I think the key decision is going to be what happens in the US EPA PM 2.5 rulemaking. It's really going to set the course for what is allowed or not allowed on the part of air districts over the next 5 to 10 years. And we should aim to do two things. We need to get good policy to protect public health, and we need to create a path for sound wildfire policy. And we can have both. We could lower the standard, but create exceptions that are partnered with better collaboration on lowering exposures, especially for vulnerable populations. But if we just act as if it's the year 2000, or we're sometime in the 1990s or even 1970, and the US Forest Service reigns supreme over wildfire in the West, we are not going to get this outcome. We're going to get an outcome where public health is protected more than it was, but not as much as the science suggests it should be. And we are barred by clean air law from adopting the wildfire policies that are going to protect communities and I think also public health in the West over the coming decade. Thanks very much. Oh, sorry, that's different.
Well, thank you, Michael. I want to respect people's time. We are at 1:24. I don't know how long Michael has. I have some time for us to stick around for some questions, but a really compelling talk, Michael, and I'm glad you ended with some suggestions, because if not, I would have been really depressed, but at least you had some suggestions. So I have questions, but I want to turn it over to the audience. I can ask Michael them on my own time. Any questions? And you can put them in the chat, or I think we have a small enough audience. Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. I think Bruce is raising his finger, the nice finger, and he has a question.
Yeah, Michael, I agree with where you're going. So I'm not going to argue on the thesis, but I'm a little confused on the facts. So, it strikes me that that this is not a very enforceable policy for the for the federal government, because they don't really have, they have very sporadic monitoring. The EPA does not have a lot of monitors, right? And so do they specify that you have to do some monitoring of the air in the area, and how do they define the area? So here I'm more focused on the 24-hour thing. It just doesn't seem, I mean, what is the area that's covered by the 24 hours, right? Is it literally homes that are adjacent to the fire? Is it 10 miles out? Is it 15 miles out? And how do they measure it? Because the number of EPA monitoring sites is relatively sporadic, and that's why everybody's using now, the purple air systems, et cetera. So how do they enforce it? And to what degree is it enforceable even?
Well, it is enforceable in areas like the San Joaquin Valley that are downwind from major sources of wildfire smoke. This can get complicated where you have complex topography and where the monitors are mostly not where the fires are happening, or have some. So just to take one example, we work really closely with the Karuk tribe up in far northern California and the Yurok tribe to a lesser degree, and they have situations where the air monitors are on the coast. They may say one thing, but the air quality and the atmospheric conditions where the burning will actually occur in the mountains far inland are quite different. And that can be a challenge. The EPA has moved toward allowing for sort of portable monitors that are kind of allowed as a supplement to the big stationary monitors that are kind of the main sources of judging whether compliance occurs or not. But the situation is evolving, I guess, is what I'd say there, but it's not perfect. And a lot of the judgments around whether, a day is a burn day or a no burn day have to do with meteorology and the ability of whether the smoke will get trapped on the ground or whether it will be lofted and then dispersed at altitude. And that you can predict, from looking at weather data. And that's a lot of what happens in practice.
And can we predict the length of time that on a prescribed fire that smoke will linger?
To some degree, it's weather forecasting, so it's not perfect, but you can predict the strength of the inversion, which is a key determinant of whether there are ground level impacts. And so the key is is the inversion gonna persist for several days, at which point you probably wouldn't want to light the forest on fire or light the forest floor on fire, or is the inversion going to break? A lot of times you see, sort of diurnal cycles where you develop an inversion and then it breaks up and then it develops again and breaks up, and that sort of thing can be fine for using prescribed fire.
Thanks for the question, Bruce. Norm, do you have a question?
Yes, actually, a comment for Michael. I'm involved with the American Bar Association section on environment, energy, resources. We have 4 or 5 publications that would love to have an article or 2 on this topic, under the theory that the more we explain, the better potential impact on EPA and others. So I think Derek has my email address, would be happy to get you in touch. And unfortunately, one of the publications is being managed by someone who teaches clinical law at Stanford University. So you'd have to deal with that.
Thank you, Norm. I'll reach out.
Sounds great, Norm. GW, you have a hand raised.
Hi. So my name's Greg. Michael, my question to you is, I think it's pretty clear that prescribed burns in areas like the San Joaquin Valley would reduce the amount of total PM 2.5 pollution on an annual or 24-hour basis, on however those standards are calculated via the EPA. Then, just unmitigated, million acre a year high intensity wildfires. I mean, you talked about 2 potential routes with respect to EPA rulemaking for PM 2.5 standards. What's to stop the EPA, or what's a potential problem, I guess is my question. What's a potential problem with declaring prescribed fires exceptional events? You just don't calculate them in the standards so as to incentivize, as much prescribed fire as possible to reduce PM exposure in the San Joaquin Valley, for example, and to make unmitigated and high intensity wildfire the stuff that's actually calculated in the PM standard.
Well, I think it's unlikely that air agencies are going to consent to having wildfire included in their.
Oh, let me add this. John Balmes also said that this should be what the EPA should do. This is what he recommended in his role as in the Clean Air Advisory Committee. Yeah. He said air districts shouldn't be giving a free pass over this unmitigated pollution, especially in the San Joaquin Valley. So this is John Balmes' thing.
No, I think the idea that wildfires are these unmanageable, sort of natural disasters just flies in the face of how agencies and trained fire managers and forest managers think about the problem, right? You can go to places like Yosemite National Park with very active prescribed fire and managed wildfire programs and a fragmented fuels landscape, and the fires happen, but they're much smaller. And then you go to places like the Forest Service lands around Shaver Lake, where you had, fortunately don't have anymore, kind of unbroken fuels landscapes that were very dense and unmanaged, and you get disasters, public health disasters. So there is pretending that this is just sort of nature and we have no control isn't consistent with what we know, what fire science and forest science teaches from long experience, particularly in the mixed conifer forests of the Sierra Nevada. However, and I should say, my suggestion that we make exceptional events determinations for prescribed fire essentially ministerial, right? By right. If you file the permit with, if you file a permit that meets certain specifications with EPA, then you are guaranteed, if you exceed the ambient air quality standard, to have because of prescribed fire, that you will get an exceptional event determination and you won't violate the act. I think that would sort of go a long ways toward what you're asking. It is not territory that EPA has been willing to stray into as of yet. And I think a lot of the reasons have to do with, I think part of the reasons are institutional, honestly, that the folks that are writing this rule, that work hard on PM 2.5, have spent the better part of their lives, or maybe their entire careers, fighting to improve particulate matter pollution in the heavily industrialized parts of the eastern United States. Getting scrubbers on coal plants, getting ultra low sulfur diesel rules in place so that diesel engines can be cleaned up using available scrubbing technology. And that's been their work. And it's very hard for those folks, I think, to fully, and I should say that in all the data that EPA evaluate, when you're an EPA regulator, you don't even see the wildfire smoke data. It's like not included in the figures, right? Because it doesn't count. And so I think there's kind of a cognitive blindness to this issue that isn't shared by people who have to actually live in the places where wildfire smoke is a huge problem. And I'd also say that there is concern about making it too easy to get an exceptional events determination, because what if that is abused, right? What if, we certainly see cases where when the monitors are down, say, like when the monitors that Bruce was asking about are broken, sometimes the polluters will pollute more. And there's some good science that's been done to show that somehow the big polluters know when these monitors are broken, and they'll use that opportunity. So if there were blanket exceptional events determinations, one worry might be that those real sources of air pollution aren't doing what they should do, that the politics of kind of local air pollution control districts, which tends to favor the polluters to some degree, might drive kind of a weakening of standards, and we might see some slippage. So I think that's a real concern. I don't want to underplay that. It's real, and we want to try to make sure that fossil sources are restrained as they should be. But we also need to grapple with the challenge that's being presented, at least in the West, due to fire.
But doesn't putting the exceptional events onus now on wildfires, right? That they're now being put into emissions inventory because they're not considered an exceptional event, right? It's put into the annual standard calculation. Doesn't that allow, for instance, in a case where there's not enough prescribed burns going on, and we're seeing an increase in acres burned in California per year, doesn't prescribed burn become, this technology like a sulfur scrubber or a diesel scrubber that they use on the East Coast, albeit a much bigger capital overlay, right? I mean, that's the sort of linkage that, needs to be theorized within the Clean Air Act here. And if wildfires are just allowed to go to not be calculated within the air quality standard, I mean, isn't the Clean Air Act sort of not even like thinking about wildfire pollution in the same way as industrial pollution, right? You're thinking about this pollution, but you're not calculating it in your standards. That's the basis for the whole act.
Greg, I think that we do need to shift how we think about it, but I would just say that there is significant institutional complexity here. Getting the Forest Service to do the kinds of things that you're suggesting that they would be obligated to do is non-trivial. And there's also, we didn't talk about it, I didn't mention it today, but looming over all of this is what happened in New Mexico. And the Forest Service mishap, shall we say, I would call it a tragedy, in New Mexico related to the Calf Canyon fire. And so I actually think that those kinds of risks do not apply to private burners. We do not see the kinds of escapes and loss of life and damage to property that the Forest Service causes when we're looking at the private prescribed burn associations or ranchers. You know, they're doing much smaller scale, much carefuler work because they're afraid of the liability issues. You know, Forest Service is immune from suit, which is kind of convenient if you're lighting the forest on fire. Private actors are not, and they, as a result, behave with greater care, I think. But there are, I think before we were to do that, we would have to think very carefully about public acceptance. And part of getting public acceptance of enhanced levels of prescribed fire is kind of working with communities to do it right. And a regulatory mandate from Washington would not, I think one thing to think about is, well, if we did that, then this would all work. Another possibility is that you get so much blowback that the Clean Air Act would be amended. And so I think there are real risks here. I'm a huge advocate for prescribed fire and for the greater use of all kinds of beneficial fire. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. But I don't think that treating it just like a smokestack makes sense. And part of the other reason for that is that, you know, smokestack pollution generates revenue, right? When people burn diesel and coal, they're doing it to make money. Generally, when wildfires occur, you know, no one's making money. There's no private interest in that activity. Now, the Forest Service is underfunded. They have institutional biases, or that they sort of like to put fires out rather than light fires. There are all kinds of things that we need to fix. I'm just not sure if this is the right. I mean, and you may be right. I mean, I'm absolutely might be wrong about this. I'm offering an opinion, not a, you know, well-shaped analysis on this point. But I'll just say, in my experience, I think that'd be a very hard sell. And the reasons might have to do as much with folks who want to do more fire and the concerns they have as the folks that are trying to block, you know, consideration of wildfire.
Yeah. I mean, at bottom, though, do you think it's a problem the EPA just doesn't calculate wildfire pollution in the Clean Air Act standard if it becomes the primary, you know, thing that people suffer from, and the EPA just says, yeah, we're not counting it anymore?
I think it is a problem, and it's one that is particularly acute given the focus of the rule. Given that the new rule, the lower standards are really only going to bind in places where wildfire smoke is really a huge issue, not a small part, not 30%, right? More than half. And one thing I'm interested in calculating and working on is developing these emissions inventories for the counties that are going to be most affected, or actually will be affected by this rule. And looking at what the wildfire component of the overall emissions inventory is in the years after 2016, because it's only after that period that we really see the acceleration in burning in the Sierra that we've all lived through. And so I think that's an important piece of information to bring to this rulemaking to help EPA make better decisions.
Well,
Thank you so
clearly,
much.
yeah, great discussion. Thanks for people sticking around a long time. And thank you, Michael, for your time today. A very revealing presentation with some possible solutions, but a lot of complexities to unravel. I hope you'll stay tuned next week. We actually have the Forest Service in the house. Different bend. You might have some hard questions for Jason, but stay tuned next week. We're going to hear from Jason Kukin from the U.S. Forest Service. So he'll have another perspective on another facet of the wildfire problem. Thank you for your time again today. Thank you, Michael. Hope to see you again next week. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.